Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's Kate Kay, and I'm here with another fireside chat. We are super lucky to be joined today by Dr. Matthew Miller, who I will allow to introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Kate. It is very nice to be with you all today, albeit a serious topic to talk through and address. And I'm so grateful that you're hosting this and that you, the audience, are choosing to participate. I appreciate that. I'm Matt Miller. I'm the executive director of suicide prevention for the VA. I'm a clinical psychologist by background and public health as well. I'm a military veteran. I served in the United States Air Force as a
Nice.
clinical psychologist during OEF, OIF, and actually did my residency at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in my hometown of Dayton, Ohio. Back then, the plan was not to get into suicide prevention. It was a briefing that I did on a weekly basis to the flying units that I worked with at Vance Air Force Base. That's a joint services undergraduate pilot training base during OEF, OIF. But one of my buddies who was a flight instructor there, Marine, he was a Cobra driver. He died by suicide. And that changed the life direction, the life course. And here I am, and grateful again to be here. I will say, even though I'm with the VA for a fireside chat, anything that I say are the opinions of Matt Miller. They are not the opinions or perspectives of the VA necessarily. But
Perfect.
I'll try to keep them.
As a lawyer, I sign off on that. Matt, just to begin, I'm really sorry about the loss of your friend. I know so many people who have been affected by things like that. And I do think it's like really lovely that it helped change your path to help other people. And to the people who are watching, I will say, yes, this is a fireside chat about suicide, which I know is a really heavy topic. And we've sort of touched on it a little bit in AfghanEvac, but not too much. So if you are watching this and you feel like you're having a hard time, just please be gentle. Don't forget that AfghanEvac has a really huge network of people for support. So if you're finding that you have any challenges watching this or even any follow-up questions, like please don't hesitate to reach out, okay? So with that, we'll get started. And Matt, one of the questions that I have for you is, what does suicidality actually look like in terms of like, what are the signs that people should sort of be aware of?
Well, I think the first thing is that it looks different for everyone in many ways. Just as everyone has individual experiences of things that happen in their life and ways of dealing with those experiences and showing how they're dealing with it. Going through thoughts, plans, intent for suicide can have very individual forms of expression. One thing I think that runs in common across the thousands of forms of expression is the word change. There typically is just a change in the person in some meaningful way.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a change in their activities. They pull away, they push away, they remove themselves, they withdraw. Sometimes it's a change in how they're engaged with their day, exercise, eating, sleeping. Big changes in those areas can be meaningful. They can start to reflect a change in their perspective, their outlook. For example, they could be the type of person that typically sees hope, sees the proverbial silver lining, and now they're saying things that just seem to reflect a very different perspective. They may say things like, I don't see any good in this. They may express extreme physical fatigue, or a lot more often, extreme emotional fatigue. I'm tired. I'm tired of this. Those sorts of statements. Those are all concerning. And I guess I would say across people, change. Look for changes that stand out to you in yourself or about someone next to you.
Okay. That helps me a lot, especially because my next question was, how can you sort of differentiate between this and the chronic symptoms of like a mental health condition? And the reason why I'm asking that question is it's personal. And I remember, when years and years ago, I was struggling with depression, and I remember thinking like, this is all just part of that, right? Like I
Mhm.
haven't crossed that line into being in a dangerous space. And my therapist offered me 2 points that really changed my perspective on how I think about suicidality and what I look for in other people. The first was that I tended to think of it as like, I want to die. That's what it is to be suicidal. And he really gently was like, it's not necessarily that, it's just that you don't want to live. And there is a difference, right? It's not that feeling of like I need a termination, but it's that feeling of like I genuinely can't persist. And that made a
Yeah.
huge difference in how I thought about it. Um, the other thing that he said to me is he would ask a lot. He would say, "Well, what are your plans for the future?" And I'd say, "Well, how far into the future?" And he would say, "Whatever. Give me a week, a month, a year." And I genuinely couldn't. I had no vision for my future in the short or long term. And like if I closed my eyes, it was black. I couldn't imagine anything. I just didn't have the capacity to like make plans. So those were two of the things that he had said to me, like, hey, when those things are kind of present in your life, they might be a signal that this is not but this is not depression. You've sort of crossed into something that's a little bit more heavy.
Yeah.
So hearing that, like, do you have anything else that you would say to a lot of our volunteers who are struggling to sort of differentiate between like, is what I'm feeling just I'm overtired, or is it,
Yeah.
like an actual mental health thing, or is it something heavier?
Yeah. I remember when I was probably a freshman, sophomore in high school, and I was really struggling with something. I recall that, and it was a lot of it was mental, and I was struggling with thoughts. I was struggling with thoughts that bothered me about myself, and I remember talking to my dad, and he was so incredibly reassuring. What he said to me is, Matt, you can't always keep a bird from landing on your head, but you can keep it from building a nest.
Okay.
And what kind of just opened up to me there is that you can have thoughts come into your head, and those thoughts may include suicide. They may include death and dying. And when it gets particularly concerning, I think, whether mental health diagnosis, no mental health diagnosis, when it gets particularly concerning is when it starts building a nest. It's not so much does that bird land on occasion, and does it
Yeah.
land during hard times? That happens to
Right.
us as human beings. What causes it to advance is, do you stick around? Does it build a nest? And the way you know that it's building a nest is you start to think about a plan. You start to think about the how to's. You start to think about the whys. And as you do that, you start to find yourself not necessarily mortified by it, actually ambivalent. So it's kind of like, yeah, I don't want to die, but I don't like this. I feel stuck. It's kind of like that teeter-totter seesaw scenario back from the playground, where you're just kind of going back and forth and in the middle and ambivalent. That's when I think it's a good time to say, all right, this is kind of building. And before it gets too big, I I should talk to somebody. It would be beneficial to talk to somebody and deconstruct this emerging nest that's forming.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I think so many people think like, oh, when you're suicidal, it's like this very obvious, heavy vocal cry for help. And I think, at least in my experience, like it kind of snuck up on me. I wasn't
Mhm,
seeing, but I was changing my behaviors like really drastically. And I
mhm.
was very ambivalent for a very long time. So like it's helpful to hear that it's not necessarily as obvious as we want it to be, but there are still signs that we can sort of, keep an eye out for.
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean, with that, does the bird land with a fully formed eagle's nest?
right.
No. I mean, it's one thing kind of at a time, building, building, building. And that's where you want to be able to kind of recognize that and find that you're spending more time in those thoughts and with those thoughts building and circulating, kind of coming back. That's when it's a really good time to say, let's think about options.
Okay. In that respect, talking about options, and I know that this is not unique to like my volunteer community, but one of the things that we are noticing is that people might be able to identify that they're in a bad place, but they still are incredibly unwilling to seek help, right? Like therapy seems overwhelming and really scary and intimate and all of these things. And especially, we've got a lot of people on active duty who are worried about what that could do to their service status. We have a lot of people who are dealing with moral injury and are thinking like, not necessarily, do I want to trust the VA to offer me help right now? It's something that we're really trying to get people kind of over that hump, but struggling with. So if you were to look at our volunteer community, like how would you help people to sort of alter their thinking to get them to a place where they're a little bit more comfortable seeking help?
I'd start with being real. So I would probably say I'm the exact same way.
Yeah.
So this is the pot, and if you're the kettle, I've got no reason to point a finger. I think a classic example of that, the first time when I was stationed with the 71st FTW, the first time I flew in the jet, I flew with a Marine,
Okay.
and he was doing everything he could to make me sick. And I was doing everything I could to keep from getting sick. And we were
Right.
going through all the aerobatics. Well, it came to a point where I knew I was going to get sick, that it's inevitable. And I went to release my oxygen mask, and I think I was panicking. I couldn't get it to release, and so I had an issue.
Mhm.
And I look back at that, and I think, why did I wait until the last second, and in this case too late, to ask for help with the oxygen mask? I didn't want to admit that I was feeling sick. I didn't want to admit that I was going to get sick in the airplane, in the jet. And so I just waited
Yeah.
until it was huge. And so I think that's a natural tendency. I think it's so natural that we were looking for ideas with a new public service campaign for suicide prevention. And I went to other veterans and said, what message do we really need to get out? And it was, don't wait, reach out.
Yeah.
And you look at our PSAs that resulted from that, those are all veterans. Those are all veterans in the PSAs. And it was veteran focus groups that kind of shaped that. In the first PSA uses that example of the frog, and the frog who stays in the lukewarm water, and then it gets hotter before long it's a boil. That's the first ad. And I saw that. I thought, oh, this will never work. Veterans don't want to hear they're not a frog and reach out. Yes, that's what we need to communicate. Don't wait, reach out. So I guess what I would say is, first, let yourself be like the rest of us who are uncomfortable with saying, I need help. And then allow yourself to move to getting help in a first step way that you're willing to take. So a first step way may not be calling to make an appointment at the VA within mental health, but a first step might be calling the Veterans Crisis Line.
Yes.
And when they ask, what's your name? Saying, you know what, I'd prefer not to share it right now. Can we just talk? And the VCL will do that. They will do that. So let yourself be normal in that way and take a first step that you would be willing to take to help yourself. And that's exactly what the Don't Wait, Reach Out campaign is all about.
Yeah.
The one thing I like about that campaign is if you go to va.gov/reach, you can privately, and this can be another step other than calling the VCL, you can privately go through and look at common issues that veterans face, common questions that they ask. You can say, all right, that's one that I've had, or that's something I've said. You can click on it, and then you can follow the options and resources. And the resources may not even entail you making a call or an appointment. It could just be a little reading.
That's a really smart thing, because I think so many people think that seeking help has to look one way. And especially like when it comes to therapy, you're like, well, once I'm committed, I'm in it. And I don't know how long it will last. And I have to immediately talk about all these things. And like, I think when it comes to mental health, especially for the veteran community, there's so many resources that are gentle and approachable, where you don't have to give your name and you can still find a support system. And so I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I think it's always just about taking the first step, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a success. Do one thing and see
Yep.
how that feels. And I think that really helps. That also ties in. My next question for you is, what does help really look like? Because I think, again, like so many of our volunteers are inclined to think like, well, help has to be one thing. It has to be, especially if I'm feeling suicidal, it has to be hospitalization, right? Like that's the only thing. Like we go to these really extreme thoughts about like, well, we'll have no control over what's happening, and like I'll kind of be stuck in this process for the rest of my life. And I don't necessarily think that's true. So if somebody came to you and they said, well, what does help really look like? I mean, it sounds like you would say it can kind of be this step-by-step approach.
Yeah, and I would say the general framework for the steps that you choose to take would fit two broad headings.
Okay.
Number one, the steps that you choose to take would help you. They would give you resources to recognize when the bird has landed and to shoo the bird away and deconstruct the nest one episode at a time.
Okay.
And that's really, you could have a day where you shoo the bird away once and that's it. And you could have a day where the bird lands 20 times in 5 minutes. So taking steps forward are getting the tools and resources to recognize, yep, I'm not going to deny it. It just landed. Now, what do I know to do to keep it from building? The second heading is it will give you, this help will give you tools and resources to be goal directed, not mood directed.
Okay.
What I mean by that is when you're having these thoughts, when that bird is perched, and when it's on top of depression, especially, what you do tends to be a direct reflection of how you feel. And so if you say, I don't feel like getting up, I don't feel like eating,
Yeah.
I don't feel like talking to anyone, that's what you do.
Yep.
And that's called mood directed behavior.
Okay.
And what we know is that mood directed behavior starts to build a rut, and it starts to get you deeper and deeper and deeper into that nest building sort of development. So what you have to kick in is something it's challenging, but if anyone can do it, I think it's a veteran. It's called goal directed behavior. So you have to say, the last thing I want to do is talk to these people right now, but I'm going to do it for 5 minutes. I am going to push myself to interact and engage as genuinely as I can for 5 minutes. I'm not going to go to the corner of the room or look for a way out. The last thing you may want to do might be to exercise. Yet you say, you know what? I don't have to train to run a marathon, but I'm going to hit the treadmill for 15 minutes and I'm going to do some light resistance training. That's it. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to push myself to it. What we know is the more you kick in the goal directed behavior, the more that tends to upend the nest building process.
Yeah.
So I would say that any help that's good help is going to give you resources, support, and encouragement to identify the bird, deconstruct the nest, and focus on goal-directed behavior.
That's really lovely. I remember when I was in a really bad spot, my therapist said something really similar, which was, it doesn't matter how much you accomplish in a day, just try to accomplish one thing. And so, especially like when you're in a bad spot, like something like taking a shower or doing the dishes, like that can be, you get in that mindset of like, I don't want to do that. And
Yeah.
he was like, hey, if you have one check mark on your day of something that you did, you are still trying, and that's a sign that you're doing a really good job. And that changed my whole perspective.
Yeah. And notice too, Kate, how in that the definition of accomplishment needs to be adjusted specific to the time.
Yep.
For example, let's take physical fitness analogy. An accomplishment when you're recovering from knee surgery may be to walk for 10 minutes slowly, guided by your care team. But where you came from was you were running a 12-minute 2 mile. Well, you better not try to go out and run a 12-minute 2 mile at that point where you're at. On the other hand, it's gonna take you down a bad path to just sit and say, because I can't do a 12-minute 2 mile, I'm not going to even walk for 15 minutes.
Right.
What's the use? Who cares?
Right.
I give up.
And I think too, the nice thing about trying to be goal directed or goal oriented is that it can give you a sense of power back at a time when you feel really powerless. Like,
Yeah.
And I can only speak for myself, but in the times when I've been feeling suicidal, I felt like I had such little control that I couldn't even control my own thoughts and how I felt. But what I could control was whether or not I did the dishes that day. And so it was such a little thing, but it was still empowering because I felt like, okay, I actually haven't given in completely to this. And that was really helpful. One of the other questions I had, and we've kind of gotten into this, is are there any coping mechanisms or strategies that can kind of help you in the meantime? So we've talked a little bit about being goal oriented and kind of making sure that you're giving yourselves those small goals, that sense of accomplishment. Is there anything else big that you can think of that you might recommend to people?
I would say one of the biggest things that I've seen is don't be your own worst enemy. Sometimes we talk about being a good friend, being a good partner, being a good son, daughter, father, mother. But when we take a look at how we interact with ourselves and talk with ourselves. It's like we never would want to hang out with that person. I mean, we're mean, we're judgy.
Right.
I would say lighten up on yourself and spend a little less time, for example, saying, why am I thinking like this? How could I have a thought like that? What's wrong with me? Oh, all these people over here have it so much worse, or this veteran had it so much worse. How I'm awful. I'm terrible for even thinking like this. That's not going to help anything. It is not going to help to put yourself in the courtroom in front of yourself as the judge and jury. What is helpful is to sit there and say, those thoughts landed. Now, do I want to make them mine? Do I want to own them? And if you don't want to own them, or you want to put that off before you buy into them, then that's where you kick in some goal-directed behaviors just to get yourself moving. If you don't do that and you try to just wrestle with those thoughts, a lot of times we're too tired to wrestle and we get pinned pretty quickly.
Right.
So that's where it's like you got to say, okay, I'm not buying it. I'm not owning that thought, but I'm not going to wrestle with it right now either. Instead, I'm going to do A, B, and C right now. We'll circle back to that a little bit later.
Yeah, that's so relevant to our volunteers, especially because I'm seeing a lot of that language of comparison, right? Like we're working with Afghans whose lives are at grave risk. And so a lot of us are inclined to say, well, my problems aren't as bad, right? Like I still have a house or a job or friends. And I think my instinct is to come back and say, we don't have to add value to our thoughts. If they're there, they exist. And like, that's what we have to deal with. And so like, if you are feeling badly, don't try to compare it to somebody because you're trying to make it go away or because you feel guilty that it's there. It is. And it's, like that's kind of a morally neutral thing. It exists and we need to move forward with it. So I think that notion of like comparison isn't helpful. And I think that that's going to stick for a lot of the volunteers.
You also don't have to own every thought just
Right.
because it's inside your head. That doesn't mean it's you.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it has to be something. I kind of consider thoughts a lot like I'm in my hotel room here in Dallas. I'm at a conference tomorrow, but I'm looking at the door. I kind of think of this a bit like the thought is knock, 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 comes to my mental awareness. I open the door. If someone goes knock, knock, knock right now, I am not obligated just because they're knocking at my door to invite them in, seat them on the couch and entertain them or dialogue with them. And thoughts are very much that way as well. Sometimes stuff you never would have imagined comes knocking on that door and you open it, and that's where you can say, you know what, I'm not going to invite you in right now. And you shut the door.
Oops. Oh, guys, I think we might have lost Dr. Miller. So let's see if he comes back. I'm hoping he does. This is a really good chat. Of course, all of the things. Oh, Dr. Miller, you're back. Sorry, we lost you a little bit, but
sorry about that.
No, you're fine. I think I was saying that the point that you were making is that we're so inclined to think like our thoughts are so representative of us and who we are, and sometimes they're just little invaders, and we need to recognize that that's what it is. I know that you are running a little bit out of time, but I did have two other questions that I'm hoping we can address. And I'm going to shift the perspective a little bit from instead of I'm not the person who is having these thoughts, but I am friends with somebody who is. How can you offer support to somebody who is feeling suicidal?
One of the biggest things is talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah, when John died, I got a phone call right away from my other buddy who was a Marine Cobra driver and flight instructor there, and Ray. And Ray's first question was, "Did you hear?" And I said, "Yes." My sergeant had just come to the door and told me. His second question was, "Did you know?" And my answer to that with Ray was no. And Ray's answer to me was no, we didn't know. And that is what I really struggled and wrestled with for about 4 years before I gave myself a little grace. I think though, what I see in that, my point is that Ray, John, and I, for all the time we spent in the flight room, for all the time we spent just sitting talking about nonsense, we never talked about mental health. I was the base psychologist. We never talked about suicide. We never talked about, do we think it? Do we not think it? And one thing I'll say that it was convicting to me, John once sent me one of his pilots, and on the slip that the pilot handed me when he walked in the door from John to me, the pilot hadn't seen this. I unfolded it, looked at it. John wrote, "I don't know what's wrong with them. Play your whale music, unzip his forehead. I don't care. He just needs to get back to flying."
Yeah.
And I kind of read that. I chuckled, and I said, "Yeah, that's John. That's Ray." I tucked it into my pocket. But you know what? I never went back and talked with John about that. And that would have been a great opportunity to open a conversation about the fact that I don't see, when we struggle with these things, it being an issue of unzipping the forehead of somebody, of playing whale music in this mysterious way. And I never did that. And so I guess my point is, talk about it. One of the most powerful things you can do is say, "Hey, do you ever think about suicide? Do you ever find it going to the point where you're thinking about a plan? And do you ever find yourself not being worried about that?" A lot of people think that if you do that, you'll plant a seed, you'll be inviting the bird to land.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that actually can serve as a huge nest deconstruction.
Yes.
For the individuals who are struggling with the bird landing called suicide thoughts.
Right.
So talk about it. That's the most powerful thing you do. And when you talk about it, don't dance around it.
Right.
So don't say, "Hey, so awkward, but have you ever thought about anything?"
Yep.
You're sending a message when you present it that way, that you feel awkward and that you're hoping they don't go there, but you want to get the question asked.
Right.
The more open you are, the more accepting you are, and the more you say the word, the more that opens the door for the nest deconstruction.
Yeah. Oof. It's so hard because I think the term suicide is so loaded. Like, it's such a thing that's so judged still, and we don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations, right? And we fear that our friends will be mad, or we can't have a real conversation with them. Like, there's so much around it. And so I think that in this role that I have with AfghanEvac, the one thing I said is I had to become comfortable with the uncomfortable. I had to be willing to have those direct questions, because it matters more to people that I not dance around the topic, because ultimately, the term suicide, we're not talking about somebody's value or their inherent character. We're talking about a symptom. And so when we're scared to say it, we're sort of making it seem like it has a much bigger statement on somebody's value than it really does. And I think the other thing is, when I was feeling this way, the thing that was really helpful was I had one friend who was a therapist, and he was not only direct, but he never infused the conversation with judgment. He never grimaced when I said I was feeling suicidal. He never told me, well, we need to fix this. He just
Mhm.
kind of let me say the things that I was going to say. And it wasn't that he didn't care that I got help, but he knew that I sort of just needed somebody to listen without judgment. And I didn't
Yeah.
want that fear that they were going to take my decision making away and tell me what to do. And for, 15 months, he was the only person who I would talk to realistically about where I was at.
Yeah.
And because of that, he was also the only person where in the really bad moments where I was like, ooh, I'm not sure that I have control of this, he was the first one I would have told.
Mhm.
So I think that removing that stigma in your own conversations can really help somebody remove it, in their own head.
Yep.
My
Yeah.
last question is, and this is a big one, but it's something that I think we can both touch on is a lot of people don't want to ask for help because they feel like a burden. And the one thing I'll say as somebody who has lost multiple people to suicide is there is no worse feeling in the world than to lose somebody to this and to feel like, what should or could I have done? Right?
Mhm.
Like, I would much rather have had every single one of them come to me every minute of every day before they took their lives to ask for my help, and I would have offered it. Because I think once we lose that person, we always have that sense of like, what could I have done?
Yeah.
And in contrast, the person who's feeling that way doesn't want to feel like a burden. They don't want to ask for help. They don't want to bring people down. But
Yeah.
that moment of hearing, like you lost your friend and I've lost people, that moment, it's never a burden. So like
Right.
how would you speak to somebody who's feeling that way right now?
Well, I mean, I would say that if John did not talk about these things with me because he was concerned about being a burden, if we had a conversation about it now, my response would be, well, John, what do you call the 5 years that followed? That was hard. That was a burden. That was
Yeah.
a lot of wrestling. I would have much rather went with you there than where I went without you for years after. Um, so I mean, I think it's natural, especially for veterans. Veterans have a very strong belief in uh not not dragging the unit down, not pulling the team down, the mission. But I'm all I can say is the best thing you can do for the mission, the best thing you can do for the team is in many cases saying, I'm hurting, I need a little support and help.
It's something so distinctly painful, especially like in the age of social media, when you see those messages, especially from veterans saying, like, I just lost a battle buddy and I had no idea. And I wish that they would have told me. I've
Yeah,
never seen somebody say, I'm glad they didn't tell me. That would have sucked. Like
yeah,
the burden is
never,
in the loss.
never.
It just
Yeah.
is.
We just announced a couple weeks ago our first year round of Staff Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox grant awardees, 80 community organizations. Something, those grants, who they're named for, Parker, his family shared with us that what they found in a note was, don't be afraid to get help.
Yeah.
But yet, I want to say irony, but that doesn't seem like the right word. But there's that tear, there's that rub where okay, I should get help, but then all these thoughts come into play. And that's where, again, I say, take a small step that you're willing to take. It could be a bit Neil Armstrong-ish in the fact that it feels small, but it's massive in the long run for you and everyone who cares about you.
Dr. Miller, the last thing that I always ask our guests, and we've touched upon a lot here, so maybe you don't have anything to say, but I say, what's one message that you would most like our volunteer community to take away from this chat?
Oh, if you have the thoughts, you don't have to own the thoughts. If you have the thoughts and you want to buy yourself some time, kick in goal directed behavior, don't engage mood directed behavior, and take steps to find resources that you're willing to engage, at least as a first step, to help you with the nest building and the bird landings, if you will. A step that's available 24/7, Veterans Crisis Line. You can reach it now by dialing 988 and pressing 1. It's not some huge number anymore. Another step is go to va.gov/reach and just point and click your way through resources and possibilities.
Yeah. I'm going to offer one too, just because it is a personal topic. And I think the thing I want people to know is that you are more loved than you realize. And there is always someone who will sit in the shit with you. Always. That's always what I say to people is like, if that's what you need from me, I will do it unhesitatingly. So just if you have an opportunity to sort of open your eyes a little bit without that judgment, I think you'll find someone who will be there. Dr. Miller, I feel so honored that you joined us today. I think this conversation was marked with not only like some really helpful things, but a lot of good vulnerability. I'm very, very grateful to you for offering us so much time. And I know that everyone in AfghanEvac will feel the same way.
Yeah, this is what it's about. I wish that getting to this point and away from a PowerPoint briefing required some pain in my life. But this is why I'm here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Thank you.